Good afternoon. We're returning now for our afternoon session. That was a fabulous lunch. Once again, this is one of the most comfortable venues I've ever been involved in because we were able to listen for 2 hours without anybody being particularly fidgety, which is rare. Anyway, once again, our thanks to the Friends of the Boca Grande Community Center, not the Civic Center, which some of us may have called it, and a lot of thanks to this wonderful staff. And now I'm going to introduce James Evans, who is no relation to Jason Evans, who will talk about more local matters. James.
Good afternoon. As Max mentioned, I'm James Evans. I'm the Director of Natural Resources for the City of Sanibel. Been with the City of Sanibel about 19 years now in January, so been quite some time working on some of these issues. Of course, I got the coveted after lunch spot after 3 very dynamic and engaging speakers. But anyway, we're really excited to be working on some of these issues. Of course, as you know, some of these issues can be quite political. But our community is starting to move forward with addressing some of these issues, and I'm going to give you some of the examples. I'm really going to address some of our environmental challenges and community options, and many of which will apply to your community as well. Of course, what we share in common with Gasparilla Island, Boca Grande, is that we're a barrier island. We gave a similar presentation at the Captiva Community Panels Forum on Sea Level Rise. And a lot of the questions we received were really, what can we do as a community to address sea level rise? So how will sea level rise affect our barrier island communities? This is a projection, a series of projections. And again, these are projections. We don't know what it's going to look like in 2100 or 2040 or 2060. But we have an idea based on the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, what that projection might look like. And this is a graphic that was put together by the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. That's a group of 4 counties on the East Coast that have really taken climate change serious and trying to mitigate and address some of the impacts of sea level rise. So the projections here, this lower one is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Intermediate or the NOAA Intermediate Low projection. It's almost like a linear trend when you look at some of the data that you saw that Jason presented earlier. It's almost more of a linear trend. But when we start to look at some of these other projections here, this is the International Panel on Climate Change. Their annual report, or 5th annual report, they have a median value. Let me go back here, sorry. And their range is somewhere between 6 and 10 inches. So that takes you from the IPCC's range to the Army Corps of Engineers high range. Again, these are projections. It's really better from a planning standpoint to look at a range of elevations rather than looking at one specific number and what it'll be on a specific date. But I think it's a good approach from a planning perspective to look at this. In 2030, they're suggesting that the range of sea level rise increase based on these projections will be somewhere between 6 and 10 inches. By 2060, we're looking at 14 to 26 inches. And by 2100, somewhere between 31 and 60 inches. And of course, Aaron and Jason alluded to, why do we care what it's going to look like 2100? We may or may not be here at that point. But I also have a 3-year-old son who will be 84 in 2100. So I hope that he gets to enjoy our community just as much as I do now. So this is the data from the Fort Myers monitoring station. And what it's projecting is somewhere between a linear trend of about a foot of sea level rise over 100 years. And that's based on 3.1 millimeters plus or minus 0.49 millimeters per year of sea level rise. And that's based on a linear trend. And of course, we know based on based on the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, they are having an impact on how quickly sea levels rise. And based on the projections that we're looking at, just to lay these out here, again, this is that Army Corps of Engineers low projection. It's almost more of a linear trend following what we see at that Fort Myers station. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers intermediate has this curve upwards here. 2063, we're looking at somewhere around 1 foot of sea level rise. We're here in 2019. When we look at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers high projection line, by 2034, we'll see about a foot of sea level rise. 2055, we're looking at about 2 feet. 2072, we're looking at about 3 feet. 2085, we're looking at about 4 feet. And by 2098, somewhere in that vicinity, we're looking at about 5 feet of sea level rise in this more extreme projection. It's important to note these because I'm going to show you a series of maps that show you the relative sea level rise. And these are the International Panel on Climate Change 5th Annual Report. These are the median values, 6-inch, 14-inch, and 31-inch. And that just kind of puts in perspective where the Army Corps of Engineers projections fall. Let me back up. From a planning perspective, we tend to lean more towards these intermediate ranges here. We don't know, based on whether or not we're able to address the greenhouse gases. We don't want to take an extreme approach to the point where our communities can't afford to address some of the issues with sea level rise or scare our community away from the table, or underestimate and just go on a linear trend. We're following some of these more moderate or intermediate projections for planning purposes. All right, so these are present conditions. Of course, this is Charlotte Harbor, Sanibel Island down here, Captiva, Cayo Costa, Boca Grande. And this is data from NOAA, and this is the 1 foot sea level rise estimate. You'll notice these blue areas here around Sanibel. We start to see some of the coastal mangroves being impacted up here along Pine Island Sound, Matlacha Pass. Here on Boca Grande, you see some impacts on the bay side. This is showing you what's going to, what relative sea level rise looks like, but that doesn't really take into account some of the changes that will occur to our shoreline because of punctuated changes associated with storm events and things like that. Of course, when a storm event comes through, if you get a head-on hit on a barrier island, your shoreline might not look like this even with 1 foot of sea level rise. It could be much more extreme. So based on relative sea level rise, this is what we could expect to see. But of course, if you get hit by a hurricane, such as Irma or Charlie even, and you have an additional 6 inches or foot of sea level rise, for example, on Sanibel, our average elevation is 4 to 4.5 feet. Imagine what an additional foot of sea level rise when your average elevation is 4 feet, what that'll do to a community like ours. It'll have a significant impact. So it's critical that we start to think about ways to mitigate those impacts. And of course, this is the corresponding chart here that I just showed you, the projections, and this is the 1 foot contour here. This is the 2 foot contour. You can see, it really is, I think, illustrated very well when you look at Pine Island. You can start to see how narrow Pine Island starts to get here. You start to lose the mangroves on the bay side. On the Gulf side, we start to see impacts, especially on Sanibel and Clam Bayou and areas like that, along Captiva, and even here as we get up into Cayo Costa and Boca Grande, you can see the narrowing of the barrier islands as we move forward. And again, that intermediate one, intermediate and low, it's beyond 2100. But if we follow that high projection and we don't do anything about our greenhouse gases and carbon emissions, we can expect to be somewhere close to that. So by 2055, we're looking at somewhere around 2 feet of sea level rise. And if you look at where we came from in 1950s, we've increased, about 8.4 inches or so since the 1950s. Here's with 3 feet of sea level rise. Again, you can see those blue areas. On Sanibel especially, you'll start to see that water moving from the outside of the island along the Gulf and in the interior of the bay into the interior freshwater wetlands of the island. you can see it starting to encroach in those low-lying areas. And here, by 4 feet, you can see most of Sanibel, except for those high developed areas, are really underwater. Again, you can see the same thing up here as we move into Boca Grande, Cayo Costa area. And by 5 feet, 2098, with the high projection, most of the barrier islands are going to be inundated. But I think we're going to see impacts to our communities well before we get anywhere close to that 5-foot contour. I would suggest that, you know, even with an additional 6 inches of water on Sanibel, we're going to see some significant impacts to the way we live on Sanibel. And so what are some of the anticipated local impacts? We can expect flooding of public and private property. We're already seeing impacts to our public infrastructure with the sunny day flooding, or we also call king tide flooding, events that occur because of what used to be just called spring tides. Now we call them king tides because, you know, we start to see impacts from these higher elevation, higher tides that are starting to impact public infrastructure. And on Sanibel, there's a couple areas in particular, end of Bailey Road, if you're familiar with Sanibel, and along Dixie Beach Road. Those are areas that regularly flood during spring or king tides. We can also expect to see higher flood insurance rates and home financing. We're hearing from realtors on Sanibel that regardless of what we're doing on Sanibel from a planning standpoint, lenders are already considering you know, what they should do about 30-year mortgages on a barrier island. And so some people are actually being turned down in areas that are high risk and the properties aren't to flood elevation because there's just too much risk. The private market is already considering the impacts. That's why it's critical that our communities step up and start to come up with strategies to mitigate these impacts. The same with flood insurance, the community rating system program that Aaron and Jason talked a little bit about. Community rating system takes into account risk, and if we're not addressing the risk, your insurance rates are going to continue to climb. And so on Sanibel, we have, you know, I think we've got a rating score of about a 4, which is pretty good for a barrier island. But of course, we have also areas on the island where flood insurance rates are pricing people out of their homes. Fort Myers Beach, I think there were some properties that were being assessed $40,000 to $50,000 a year for flood insurance. So you can imagine what impact that would happen if you were going in for a mortgage to get a home, and then you found out your flood insurance rates were going to be, you know, anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 a year. We can expect to see declines in property values. We can expect to see loss of natural storm buffers. Jennifer Hecker talked a little bit about the impact of mangroves and other vegetation along the shoreline, dune vegetation, and the mangroves along the bay. The mangroves will be the first to be impacted. Of course, if there's no developed area on the inside of where those mangroves are, they'll start to move inland, which is a good thing. And I'll talk a little bit about what Sanibel's strategy has been to address some of the wildlife and habitat issues and to allow for migration of some of those mangrove fringes to move inland. There'll be an impact to public infrastructure, roadways, bridges, wastewater treatment plants. Of course, on barrier islands, septic tanks are challenging to, you know, don't function that great on barrier islands with our higher water table, but when you add sea level rise to it, you get tidal pumping, and that tidal pumping can actually pull those nutrients from those septic tanks into our coastal waters. So not only are we seeing impacts from harmful algal blooms because of changing climate, warmer water temperatures, more nutrients coming off the landscape with higher rainfall, but we're also seeing nutrients being pulled out of these septic drain fields and into the coastal waters that could be exacerbating things like red tide and blue-green algae blooms. Of course, water supply is you know, something that's very vulnerable to sea level rise. For example, you know, along the coast, you know, on Sanibel, we get our water from the from aquifers deep in the ground, and we use brackish water. We treat it through reverse osmosis. We are able to provide that as potable water to our residents. But of course, with sea level rise, the concentration of salt in that water is going to increase. And as it increases, the cost of treating that water gets more and more expensive as the salt concentration in that water goes up. So something we really need to think about Are we going to be able to afford the water supply once we get to a point where we're essentially, distilling, fresh water from salt water, and that becomes a tremendous added cost. Cultural resources, of course, there's a lot of cultural resources here on Boca Grande, and those are things that are really susceptible to sea level rise and flooding. How do we continue to adapt? How does our community adapt and continue to protect those things that we find as a community that are important? Do we just elevate them? Do we relocate them? How do we deal with those cultural resources? And of course, water quality, we talked a little bit about that. Jennifer gave a very good overview of what we can expect as far as impacts from climate change on water supplies. And we're experiencing some tremendous impacts on water quality from Lake Okeechobee because of the blue-green algae blooms that occur in Lake Okeechobee, but also the blooms that occur within the Clusachy watershed, the red tide blooms that are being exacerbated by the nutrients that are coming off the landscape. And a lot of scientists feel strongly that the warming temperatures, climate change is having a direct impact on blue-green algae biomass and things like that. And as that blue-green algae breaks down, it can actually provide nutrients that are directly available to red tide and other harmful algal blooms. So these are all things that are going to have a direct impact on our economy, and I'm sure your community is very well aware of the connection between water quality and your local economy. I can tell you Sanibel is. We spent about $1.6 million cleaning up dead fish on the beach. About 850,000 pounds of dead marine life was removed this summer. We had cancellation rates at our hotels about 78%. And we had about $47 million in lost revenue this summer, just between between July and October. So pretty big impact on the local economy just from water quality. That doesn't even take into account all of the other impacts of climate change and sea level rise. And of course, what will be the impacts to wildlife habitat and species diversity? I know Kelly's going to talk a little bit about that with her sea turtle data. But of course, on Sanibel, we are known as the seashell capital of the world. And of course, with things that I'm not going to talk about today, such as ocean acidification and other things associated with climate change, we run the risk of losing the very things that make Sanibel a tourism destination. So there's a lot of things that we need to consider when taking into account the impacts of climate change and sea level rise. So I mentioned this earlier, independent of what our local communities do to address climate change and sea level rise, the private sector is also already assessing risk. And so this is a figure that was prepared by the National Academy of Sciences, and they evaluated how flood insurance was tied to flood risk, and this was published in 2015. And what this graph shows is the black line represents all disasters, and the gray line represents just flood disasters, and these are the number of presidential disaster declarations. And what you'll notice from 1953 to 2013, that this is trending upwards. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, that if you own an insurance company or you're a lender, and you're evaluating properties on barrier islands that are highly susceptible to flood risk, that you need to take that into account when issuing policies or lending money to people that want to purchase homes on barrier islands. So that's why it's so important. I know there's been a lot of communities out there that say, well, if we don't acknowledge it, then it's not going to happen, and the market's not going to increase our flood insurance rates. Well, I can tell you that's not the case. So what are local communities doing to mitigate the impacts of sea level rise? And I'm just going to give you some of the examples of things that we're doing on Sanibel. So we developed a floodplain management planning and mitigation advisory committee. That was really to look at areas on Sanibel, on low-lying areas within the floodplain, and how those areas would be susceptible to sea level rise. We've also developed a floodplain mapping and data collection process where we've integrated that into our stormwater management plan. We've also converted our entire island. We're at about 95% from septic to central sewer. We hope to finish phase 4 in the next 2 years. We've developed setbacks as part of our comprehensive land use plan. As part of the Sanibel plan, we established the 1974 Coastal Construction Control Line for setbacks, and we've kept septic tanks and all of those things landward of that line. And we also have very strong ordinances and regulations that protect the dune, which of course makes the community more resilient by protecting that dune and dune habitat. We've also developed planning and zoning and building codes that will keep the elevations of properties at an appropriate elevation to reduce risk. We also completed an island-wide beach management plan in 1994, which we're in the process of updating right now, and that will also include a chapter on the impacts of sea level rise and climate change. We also have extensive open space preservation. About 2/3 of Sanibel has been protected for conservation purposes, specifically for wildlife and wildlife habitat. We are a sanctuary island for wildlife and wildlife habitat. And what that has allowed us to do is buy up those lands that are in low-lying areas, specifically in our interior freshwater wetlands. And that's actually taken a lot of developed area out of the pool that can be developed, which has reduced the risk on Sanibel. So there's really a dual benefit. We also have a stormwater management plan, and we just updated that last year. As I mentioned, we are experiencing the impacts of these sunny day flooding events or king tides, and we're looking at ways to address some of the things that Jason talked about. We're looking at updating some of our infrastructure, and I'm going to give you some examples of what we've done in one community to address water control structure that was set at a control elevation in the 1970s that was too low, and we saw some flooding from the bay during regular tides, not king tides, but just regular tides, because of the changes in sea level rise. We've also enhanced our coastal habitats, and we've done some living shoreline projects, and Hans Wilson, one of the engineers that's going to be speaking after me, is going to talk about some of the projects he's done. But he's come up with some really innovative ways to protect our shorelines on Sanibel. And finally, this year in January, we kicked off a study, an assessment of Sanibel's coastal vulnerability to sea level rise and increased storminess. So it's not just the incremental impacts of sea level rise, but it's also those punctuated changes that come with storms and storm events. And so we wanted to look at the areas within our community, similar to what Jason did I believe it was Satellite Beach, where you looked at the vulnerable areas. We developed a list of 8 community teams that will look at 8 different sectors of our community, everything from natural resources and cultural resources to education to the community at large. And of course, we've integrated the development community, the real estate community, and also our community planning into this. And we'll come up with an inventory of all the areas on Sanibel that are particularly vulnerable. And I would argue everything on a barrier island is pretty vulnerable to sea level rise. Once we get that done, then we will actually do some modeling using digital elevation mapping and other tools to figure out what areas are vulnerable, and then develop a list of projects that will be put into a sea level rise adaptation plan. So that's the next step. And I would always encourage communities to take kind of a stepwise approach, not dive into it all at once. Do some of the work that Jason has done to kind of lay the groundwork and come up with a plan. Like Aaron indicated, you might be surprised, what it might cost to upgrade all of your infrastructure. But if you do it a little bit at a time, instead of waiting until you realize that we're on the high projection rather than the intermediate or low, then you'll be able to start saving and putting money towards those plans early on. But if you wait and you realize, well, it doesn't look like we're going to follow the Paris Climate Accord. It looks like the carbon emissions are much higher than that, so we can expect the ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland to start collapsing, and now we need to do something. Well, don't wait. I just encourage you to move forward now. And so, of course, Sanibel has really taken a conservation approach to reducing risk. And when we look at the island, you'll notice, one thing you'll notice about Sanibel is all these green areas are areas that have been set aside for conservation purposes. This is the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. We have a lot of lands that are owned by the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, as well as the city of Sanibel. and those have been set aside in perpetuity for conservation purposes. And when you look at the 3-foot contour, you'll notice, or the 3-foot elevation, sea level rise projection, you'll notice that most of those areas that are flooded are the interior freshwater wetlands of the island that are low-lying areas, Ding Darling Wildlife Refuge, and other areas that are actually have already been taken out of development. That's not to say at 3 feet, I don't think Sanibel is going to be a great place to live with 3 feet of water on top of what we have today. But still, these are things that we don't need to worry about in the future. We don't need to think about how we, move forward with taking procedures or eminent domain to buy these properties out. And those are areas that we don't have to protect. Certainly, we want them to be protected for wildlife and wildlife habitat, but we don't have to worry about protecting structures. And so I want to give you, some examples of what we've done on Sanibel. And this is a map of Sanibel Island. This red line here depicts the eastern Sanibel Slough or Sanibel River Basin. This is the beach road water control structure. It's a weir. This basin here is our western basin, and this, all of the water within these polygons drains to the structure here, which is the Tarpon Bay Weir. And so in 1994, we actually rebuilt these structures. We increased the elevation of those structures to retain more water in the interior freshwater wetlands of the island, primarily to combat saltwater intrusion from the bay and the Gulf into the wetlands so that we can keep those freshwater wetlands. We also bought out some of the properties in this area, helped them raise their properties so that we could raise the water table within these areas. Of course, we get complaints every time there's a rain event, but there hasn't been any major flooding of infrastructure since we did that. This basin down here was one of the earliest parts of the island that was developed, so we have a lower elevation in this basin than we do in this basin, but for the most part, it's working very well. And I just want to give you an example of what we did in one community. This is the Dunes Community Weir Modifications Project. I don't know if you're familiar with Sanibel, but this is the Dunes Golf Course community located at the east end of the island. This is Dixie Beach Road. Out here would be Tarpon Bay. Over here would be San Carlos Bay. And Periwinkle Way would be somewhere in this area here. So this is a water control structure that separates the community from what we call Ladyfinger Lakes and Tarpon Bay. The system was designed in the 1970s to hold water within this community for stormwater. The idea is to hold as much water that runs off the landscape in an area for as long as you can to treat the nutrients and reduce the nitrogen and phosphorus before it flows into our coastal waters and allow it to perk into the ground. But what we found was that even during normal high tide events, we were getting a lot of water that was coming in from the bay, in from Tarpon Bay and Ladyfinger Lakes, and it was backing up over top of the weir. The weir control elevation was set too low, and this was set in the 1970s. And we deployed, working with the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation's Marine Lab, as well as the Ding Darling Wildlife Refuge, their friends group there, we deployed some monitoring stations to look at the water that moved in and out of the system. And here you can see where the water elevation on the golf course side was the same as the water coming in from the bay. And you can see along this weir structure all the algae growing along here, so you know it's very enriched in nutrients. And what we found was that because of sea level rise and the changes in the hydrology, that those lakes would artificially fill up with water from the bay. And it wasn't functioning as a stormwater system anymore, and all of the nutrients, the nitrogen and phosphorus, were actually flowing out freely into the bay. So this was partly a water quality project and also an issue to adapt to the impacts of sea level rise. So we worked with an engineer, and they designed a one-way flow gate, and that was installed on the weir here. So water can leave the system, but water can't come in from the bay. So that did two things. It increased the capacity of the stormwater system, but it also helped us balance the salinity within these stormwater ponds. And now it's allowing us to allow vegetation to start growing in the littoral zones around the lakes, so we can actually get increased water quality treatment within those lakes. So that's been for a very small project, it's had a number of very important benefits. Another project that we did on Sanibel was living shoreline, a couple of living shoreline projects. 2 are completed, 1 is in the works. These have been designed by Hans Wilson and Associates. And we followed what a concept called the living shoreline concept, and it's really the use of man-made materials along with natural materials, such as mangroves and other vegetation like buttonwoods that are really good at creating stormwater buffer, or erosional buffers along the shoreline. And of course, things like these are called reef balls. Those are cement structures that are poured and cast, and they're placed along the shoreline to attenuate wave action. And then what Jennifer Hecker talked about a little bit was oyster reefs, bagging up oyster reef shell, fossilized shell, and placing it along the shoreline to help attenuate that wave action. The goal of living shoreline projects is not to harden the shoreline. It's really to soften the shoreline and to make sure that the shoreline can adapt to changes in sea level and to knock down that wave action as it comes to the shoreline and would normally erode the shoreline. You knock that wave energy down, and you don't just reflect it or refract it somewhere else. You knock that wave energy down so that the vegetation can grow, and that's really what's holding your shoreline, the vegetation, not the hardened structure. But they work in tandem. And here's an example of a project that Hans Wilson Associates did on Fort Myers Beach at Snook Bight Marina, where they took these reinforced culverts or reinforced concrete pipe, they inverted them, and they created these mangrove planters along the seawall. And you can see here what it looks like along the seawall. Here, the mature mangroves grow, the prop roots, the drop roots come out of those pots, those planters, and they stabilize the shoreline. And while doing that, they also soften the impact of wave action along the shoreline. So that's been very successful. And we employed that on one of our projects at the Bailey Beach Park restoration. This was a public-private partnership between the city of Sanibel and a private property owner, where we installed these reinforced culvert pipes, planted it with mangroves and other vegetation. And this is what it looks better than this today, but this is some of the vegetation starting to come in here. And of course, with the hurricanes that come through, cold fronts and things like that, they do knock it back, but then it comes back. Ultimately, when the vegetation is grown in, that will be the thing that will hold the shoreline as we move forward. But it's been very successful. Instead of transferring that wave energy down the shoreline from these seawalls here, we've actually been able to soften the shoreline as it moves around this corner here. And we've actually started to see accretion of sand downdrift of where this structure was created. So it's really been a win-win. And ultimately, we also want to have wildlife habitat and fisheries habitat that will be created as part of this project as well. This is another example of a project we did at Lighthouse Beach Park. This was the roadway that connects Periwinkle Way to the historic Lighthouse Beach. Very, very well traveled, and this is an area that's visited by the public. We had habitual flooding that would occur after, every cold front, every storm event that came through, and you could see the erosion that occurred here, and we'd have to essentially replace the road after every event. We went in here and we, this is just an example to show you where we had the erosion occurring in here. Public Works built this wooden revetment here, which was actually starting to exacerbate the erosion on both sides of the project. Hans Wilson Associates designed a project for us using riprap, these reinforced culvert pipes that were inverted, and mangroves and buttonwoods, and you can see a cross-sectional view here. The idea is that once we get the plants established, they'll knock down the wave energy and protect the roadway here. And here's what it looked like after we completed the project. The reinforced culvert pipes are right here. And then, of course, after Irma and a number of other storm events that came through, about 80% of those trees are gone. But in the past 5 years, we haven't had, any access to the Lighthouse Beach cottages interrupted. So it's, in my opinion, it's a win-win, and been a very successful project, and we'll continue to plant this. It's going to probably take us several years to get those established. Another project that we're working on is the Woodring Living Shoreline Project. It's about 1,000 linear feet of shoreline that we're trying to protect. This is an area that erodes quite often because of the the fetch that comes off of Pine Island Sound and the boat traffic that comes through here. Hans was able to design a project similar to what we did at Lighthouse Beach Park. The difference here is that we're using reef balls to use as a way to attenuate that wave action before it gets to the shoreline. We went out to bid. The project came in considerably above budget, so we're going back out to bid, and we hope to have that project completed this year. So I'm just going to wrap up here. Next steps. We're going to finalize it and update our beach management plan. We hope to have that done in the next month and a half. That'll address some of the issues associated with sea level rise that we can incorporate into our comprehensive land use plan. And of course, Aaron mentioned the peril of flood statute. That's something that all local communities need to incorporate into their comprehensive land use plans when they update what's called the evaluation and appraisal report. We're getting ready to do that in the next 2 years. So we need to make sure that any new development moving forward addresses the impacts of sea level rise as it relates to flooding of infrastructure and developed areas. We're going to be completing our sea level rise vulnerability study, and after we get that done, our plan is to move right into our coastal modeling to evaluate the different sea level rise scenarios. And as I mentioned, we're probably going to use the intermediate to intermediate high scenario for our modeling. We're going to also update the Sanibel plan for consistency with the peril of flood statute, and then of course we're going to develop a sea level rise adaptation plan. Of course that's going to be a policy decision that's going to have to be made by our city council, but right now our city council has been very supportive of addressing these issues with sea level rise because we know it has an impact on our local economy, and just putting our head in the sand is really not an option. And of course that's going to have a list of mitigation strategies to make our community more resilient. And I'll just leave you with this cartoon. So what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? That would be great. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Hans Wilson, who I've kind of given him an introduction because he's done a lot of great work on Sanibel. But Hans has been a coastal engineer in Fort Myers for how many years now?
Oh,
long time. Is that it? There it is. Okay. Let's see. How do we? Is that a open with Keynote? Thank you. That's why you leave this to the IT guys. All right, Hans, it's all yours.
all right. Let's see what we got here. You broke it, James. Trying to get it to go backwards. There we go. Click on that one. All right. Let's try it again. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Tough acts to follow. These are some great speakers. My name is Hans Wilson, and I am a professional engineer by trade. I was basically I'm a native Floridian, and am I doing that? Oh, it's on auto.
I didn't put it on auto. Sabotage.
Which, by the way, is a great name if you're not named Hans.
So, oh, it's on animated. I'm not sure. Do we have an IT guy in the audience? That's a Mac, so we'll blame it on the Mac. Is it on autoplay or something? It might be on autoplay. So. Move slide share.
I swear we did this before.
Here it is. Unclick. Are they all set up like that?
Yeah. Somehow.
You're learning valuable skills today.
So this is the preview section of the talk. Get to see all the comic, all the details, even the closing slide.
Yeah, so the actual topic. Just to recap.
Yes. So this will go very quickly now. But just as a background, I am a professional engineer, and I grew up in the back bays of Pine Island Sound. At the ripe age of 19, I was blessed to be able to move to Captive Island and learned a lot about the coastal processes, both on the Gulf side as well as the Bay side. And that was what sort of formulated my interest in coastal engineering and getting involved in the marine environment. So in my world, I look at everything sort of from the marine perspective. And as a result, to quote Rutger Hauer from Blade Runner, I've seen things you people would not believe. So let's talk about sea level rise, because it's only slightly less esoteric than interplanetary travel and time-space continuum. We got a lot of folks here that have been doing a lot of research. And the most recent one talks about the temperature changes, the IPCC report, looking at about a 1.5 degree Celsius temperature change as the warning level or the global warming increasing that we need to be concerned about. So in terms of sea level rise, there's a couple of different ranges here, and we've got some people here that have talked about that quite well. You can see we've got the high scenarios that takes us somewhere to 2 to 6.5 feet. The intermediate scenarios and the low scenarios. And I think, we've already seen those graphs, so it's no point in belaboring those. But we do have, from an engineer's perspective, sort of the fundamentals, because we're the guys that have to be concerned about health, safety, and welfare of the community. That's part of being a professional engineer and a license holder. And so we're looking at things from the ground up. What's taking place? And what is it about sea level rise that's so concerning for us? And one of the most critical factors is it's relatively insidious. You just don't see it until it's in front of you in different ways. It also deals with a lot of politics. And it requires fortitude and sort of the long view, and our society seems to be getting away from that. And a little more immediate gratification seems to be a lot of how we look at things. So particularly in politics, the politicians really want to get voted into their next cycle instead of doing the right thing to deal with the long view of what needs to take place. So what are the most immediately noticeable changes that are not natural? Well, actually none. It's all natural in its action, and it's a natural response to a man-made impact. And do we need to panic? Now, some people are sort of panic-driven a lot of times because we live in a fairly comfortable world. We're not really challenged by a tiger around the corner that's going to eat us, so we sort of make up these paper tigers. And the media has done a pretty good job of pandering to our made-up paper tiger environment. So we kind of tend to panic, but it really depends on what your timeline is. And I think two of the speakers made really great points. Their timelines were not the politics of it. Their timelines were their children. And I think that is a timeline you need to take a look at when you're dealing with sea level rise. So who said what? We've got a couple of different sources here that we've looked at in terms of information. You can see the graphs that talk about changes over time. We've got atmospheric temperature trends for the past 130 years. We've got sea level rise data that we're talking about. You can see these variables that are here. We've, understand that our technological and scientific understanding is constantly changing as time goes on. We're learning more and more about just how to learn. And so as part of that, we're taking all this information and trying to assimilate it to make decent decisions on what's going to happen in the future. So in this particular case, we're looking at sea level rise, again, in that 2 to 6 foot. And where are we today in 2000 and moving forward? And in this particular point in time, we're at 3.3 millimeters per year, where before we were less than 1 millimeter per year. So there's some pretty much in-your-face scientific information that tells us that we need to sit up and pay attention. Oh, son of a gun. Let's try this again. Ah, there it is. Okay, got it. Okay, so Skeptics with the Sea. This is Leon Ashby, president of the Climate Skeptics. Why an emissions trading scheme is not necessary. Well, that's how he spells skeptics, by the way. It's spelled with a K. Because I did this PowerPoint about, I don't know, a year and a half ago, and I was wondering, why did I use this title? And I realized that that's how he... So anyways, there are people that are skeptics out there and deniers. Those people are important. And the reason why they're important is because it causes the people that are in the know, that are the true scientists, to mind their P's and Q's. And it calls to question some of their decisions and makes them look back at what their research has revealed. And I think that's important. So it kind of balances in many respects. But you could take a look, on this one particular slide, they're looking at this leveling off a data point and saying, oh, well, sea level rise is not. It's leveling off now. But come on, let's hindcast a little bit and take a look at what's really taking place here. What I was interested in was this data in this location. There's also some correlations here in terms of fossil fuel versus temperature change. And, you can make the data kind of talk any way you really want it to. But I think we've got some fundamental items that are really, really important to take a look at, which drives me towards, what are the marine engineers? Those are my people. Those are my brethren. Those are the guys that are out there trying to figure out, okay, I've got a shipping company, and I need to offload my ships into a port that's next to a huge water body. How am I going to do that if all my equipment is underwater? Those are the real guys. Those are the guys that are trying to deal with what's in front of them in terms of challenges. So Duncan Mailer did a pretty good assessment. You can see sort of what this line reveals in terms of the rates. And again, we're looking at this 2 to 3 millimeters per year, which, these are fairly small numbers on an annual basis. But you got to take a look at what's the long term, where are we headed in the long term as you try to make decisions. So again, now I'm talking to coastal engineers. They got their fundamentals, and these are the guys that are looking at our coastal processes. They are, in many cases, very scientific in their work, and you start taking a look at what the trends that they're using, and these are the observations. And then, of course, you get this wide split in terms of the data. You have all this variations in sea level rise over time, but again, you still see these trends. And so, as the common man would say, yes, pretty much in my mind, sea level's rising. okay? But at what rate? Well, I'm not James Evans. I don't have to plan from that standpoint in 100 years. I'm an engineer. I've got to design as part of that planning process on sort of a more immediate basis. So I have to take a look at what's the tide information for my area, because all the discussion has been fairly global in its presentation, and the tide information, and that's what I've been working with for many, many years as part of planning and design for marina facilities. I use tide station information, and it's interesting, if you've been in the business for as long as I have. I've been doing marina and waterfront planning and design for 30 plus years, over 3 decades, and I know these tide stations very well. And when I go back and look at the updated 19-year epic, which is what these tide stations are based on, and you can see graphically the increase in the water levels overall. I mean, there's no question that we've got sea level rise. So following through with Dr. Dean and Todd Walton, I thought I would kind of give you an idea of what we have to deal with in terms of the coastal processes. And though it's not necessarily time-space continuum, it is in many respects complicated in terms of what happens along our coastlines. And so as an engineer that's dealing with the Gulf Front coastline, beach restoration projects, we work with the Captive Erosion Prevention District, as well as bayside facilities, marina facilities, shoreline revetments, living shoreline projects. We have to sort of pay attention to what's going on with these processes. And what I want to point out out here is this: in this equation you're talking about, studies show that it works well only if other factors causing shoreline change are negligible. And this has to do with the relationship of sea level rise in relation to the total movement of shoreline recession along the coastline. So, and I thought I would just, give you an idea of what that coastal space-time continuum might actually look like, and give you an idea of these are the things that are related to just shoreline change along the Gulf Coast. This is just a movement of your beach. And you have these things that you have to consider in terms of how does your shoreline change? Well, it's a function of onshore sand transport, the movement of the upper beach. You've got the sink. Where's the sand going? It's dropping into your inlets. It's running down the coast of Gasparilla Island and dropping into Boca Grande Pass. You've got sources like beach renourishment, where we're pumping that sand back out onto the beach. And then you've got sea level rise, and that's a very small component of a very large and fairly complicated equation that makes an attempt to determine the onshore and transport processes in our coastal environment. So it is pretty close to that space-time continuum I was talking about before. Okay, sea level rise. Okay, this is looking at where we are today, and this is a typical tide station for North Captive Island, which is the area I'm going to sort of focus this talk on. But again, Captiva is a coastal barrier island, just like Gasparilla Island is, just like Sanibel is, Cayo Costa, North Captiva. And so if you take a look at that St. Pete tide projection, which is what I felt was pretty representative and pretty close to what you would take into account if you were sort of doing some planning, you get almost a foot over this 61-year time frame that we're looking at. It's probably a little bit not as radical in terms of some of the greater ranges, like 6 feet, but it just kind of gives you an idea of how that transpires relative to what occurs in our tide range. You've got mean low water here, and you've got mean high water here, and if you look at that tide range, if that all shifts by this distance, 1.4 feet, that mean high water line's another foot higher, and that's having an impact along the shoreline. So how can I see sea level rise? The short answer is that you won't. It's a matter of millimeters, and they're incremental millimeters over an annual basis. So from the beachfront or coastal perspective, you're going to see subtle changes. That spring tide that you remember, or that coastal event, gosh darn, it looks like we're getting a lot more water coming up on our beach than we have in the past. It's almost kind of that intuitive feel, like something's wrong, something's different. And so when you take a look at that and you contrast it with the impacts from storm-driven surges and wave setups, which are in multiples of feet, It's very, very hard to really distinguish sea level rise from just average annual events. So I thought what I'd do is kind of give you a coastline view, and this is what we're dealing with. We have, on Captiva, we have restored our beach, much as you've done on Gasparilla Island. And we have this normal beach template that we have that runs out to about minus 14 feet. That's pretty typical. And then we got the top of the beach berm here. And this is a typical profile. And as you see, you know, this elevation change, and I'm just using that 1.14 feet for discussion purposes, basically to say, hey, it's going to raise up that water level over time, and it's going to have a different impact along this beach face. And it's going to move that impact further landward. So how do we adapt to that? Well, in our beach restoration project, and we're getting ready to do one in 2020, now we've elevated the dune. We've raised the dune up and created a higher dune on the beach side. And we're adding more sand to bring this beach face up higher and adapting to that sea level rise. That's fairly easy to do on the Gulf side because the Gulf side is relatively high. Here on Gasparilla Island, it's very high. I mean, when you stand at the top of what used to be the breakwater that was on the beach side there, you know, you're at a very, very high elevation, so sea level rise isn't going to have that much impact. And then when you add a beach restoration project and you take that mean high water line, and if you remember the days when you used to lap against the shoreline and the rocks, now you got a nice wide sandy beach. It's even, sea level rise impacts are even less perceptible because that storm surge event or that hurricane that breaks its wave energy 100 feet away, you don't really see that. And if you got this incremental sea level rise on which those waves are added in terms of height, it's still being held off further away. So what will I see? You know, the long answer is incremental, almost imperceptible changes in the lower lying areas. And I think James really addressed this quite well with Sanibel sort of functioning as the canary in the coal mine. And the increased saltwater intrusion that you're going to see is going to take place in wells. Part of that's attributed to upland impacts, coastal flooding, decreased efficiency in your septic systems. And then it will begin below the Earth's surface. That's where you're really going to start seeing or recognizing the change from sea level rise. It's not going to be necessarily those media moments when we've got a king tide and someone's got to plow through salt water that's coming up through the stormwater drains like we've seen in places like Fort Myers Beach. But it's going to be a much broader impact for folks that, for example, that live on the coastal areas on the bay side of a barrier island. They're on septic systems, or they have shallow water wells for their irrigation. So this is what's been termed chronic inundation, and this is from the most recent report by the Union of Concerned Scientists, 2018. And this is what they're talking about is today you've got this normal condition of, you know, the tide range from A to B, where A is our high tide level, and then we've got this chronic flooding occurring that takes place, whether we've got a storm surge or whether it's a rain event or something of that nature, if this is an impounded waterway. And then you can take a look, and it talks about permanent inundation, this zone which is underwater with each high tide, which is in this area right here, and then chronic inundation, which is this location. It's a fairly sort of broad-based graphic, but it kind of, I think what's important about it is that it gives you a pretty good contrast between, you know, what we're looking at today and what's the future impact going to be with sea level rise. And I think what's really important is paying attention to this line right here in relation to these residences. So what I did is I kind of did, you know, the engineering approach was to do a drawing that says what I want to say. And this kind of gives you a sense in the same relationship of, you know, here's your offshore bottom profile. This is your mean high water and your mean low water elevations. And it's fairly small. You know, our tide range in this area is not that significant, 1.5 to 2 feet, depending on where you are. And then as you come to the upland, you know, typically our land mass rises up very, very gradually. And getting back to the question the gentleman asked in this morning session, which was for a certain amount of rise in terms of sea level rise, how far landward does that move? it really depends on how flat the land is that you're living on. And as we know, Florida is, it's flat. That's why they call us flatlanders when you go up in the Carolinas. So what happens is when we get to the sea level rise, you get a foot rise here, this upland area where we have this freshwater lens, where before that freshwater lens extended down to this bottom line, this was the mix between saltwater intrusion and freshwater. Your well, your irrigation well for potable water was working just fine. Your septic drain field was draining just fine. It was working. But you get this little bit of incremental rise in sea level, and all of a sudden this salt water intrusion that we're talking about permeates further into the land, and you have this sort of wedge where it's forcing that fresh water further landward. Well, now what's happening is your irrigation well, you're now starting to pick up brackish water. Next thing you know, it's salt water, and your plants are turning brown. If you're relying on that for potable water, as the city of Sanibel does, that's a real issue. And your drain field, your septic system is not functioning. It's now being flooded, and it's discharging and exchanging through this medium here into the water body, and that's exacerbating our nitrogen loading into our estuaries. So not to repeat the same things, but these are the areas that you're going to see the most immediate impacts from sea level rise. Again, septic drain fields, your irrigation wells, and your stormwater management. So, the solution and at what cost? And I like this because the bottom line is that the first mistake that we made as a society was going and developing our coastlines right out to the edge of the water. There's no question about that. Now that sea level is rising, there is this fundamental decision that needs to be made. Are we going to try and hold the line like they do, like the Danes do, where they just build these big dikes to hold the water back? Or do we slowly recede from the shoreline? And either way you look at those options, and those are the extreme options, it's going to cost money. And when it costs money and it comes out of our pockets, the only way that's going to occur is if the politicians decide that they want to charge you that money to fix these problems. So again, that's why it gets back to my statement about it's political, and it requires the long view to make a decision on exactly what you need to do. So, intermediate opportunities. Septic tanks, drain fields, let's get rid of them. Let's get on central sewer. Worst case scenario, if you're not on central sewer, let's relocate our septic systems to higher ground, away from the water areas. And I think it's important that we start putting into play, and I think we're going to see this under our current administration, an effort to deal with our septic systems, which are problematic in many respects. Irrigation wells, again, relocate them. You can use desalinization processes, which are expensive, but it still keeps them in place. Stormwater management discharges. James had a classic example of what needs to be done to deal with those things. But again, in many respects, they're short-term fixes. That's probably a 30-year fix, given the rate of sea level rise. We're going to be adapting as we go and making those decisions. At some point, if the county doesn't come in and elevate your road, then you're going to need to make a decision whether you want to either relocate your home or buy a four-wheel drive truck or learn how to run an airboat for those king tide events. So that talks about our street drainage. And then, of course, seawalls. You know, the problem with seawalls, first off, is that they're a very hard fixed structure. They have a tendency to reflect the wave energy back. They're not very environmentally compatible. And really, the best solution is to proceed with ways that you can still attenuate the incoming wave energy to protect the natural vegetation along the shorelines. And that's really, really important because that natural vegetation creates habitat, filter feeder mechanisms, and if you do it right, it allows that vegetation to continue to move landward over time as sea level increases. And then, of course, the natural resources. You know, you're just going to have to anticipate the loss of natural resources. My senior project manager, Chester Young, and I were having a conversation the other day. And he's an old salty dog like me, and we see things, and we talk about stuff. And he said, you know, I couldn't figure it out, Hans, but I was looking at the cabbage palm trees around one of the up the river boat yards that we were dealing with, and he says, I just keep noticing that they keep getting smaller and smaller, and they're starting to die off. And he said, I finally realized what they're dealing with is more saltwater intrusion. The salt is getting further up the Caloosahatchee River, and the cabbage palms are not adapting to that much salt inundation over time. So, I put this graphic up here for a couple of things I wanted to talk about just briefly, and I know this is a thank you slide, which means I'm done speaking, which is probably a blessing. But when Hurricane Harvey showed up in this community, they got a tremendous amount of media attention, huge amount of media attention, and deservedly so. And there's a great article about sort of an amateur meteorologist that actually had predicted what the problem was going to be with Hurricane Harvey in terms of its going stationary and dropping a lot of water in that location. Well, at the same time that was happening, we had about a 3-day event that was a spinoff from Hurricane Harvey. And this was 2 weeks prior to Hurricane Irma that dumped a huge amount of water in the coastal community here. And so you see me standing out. This is my main driveway coming in, invest in mullet boots for the future. And what I'm showing you here is that while this is a rainfall-related event, with sea level rise, it takes much longer for this water to drain off the land and get to our tidal waters. And what that ends up doing is that ends up saturating the soil to a tremendous level so that when we have another wind-driven event like Hurricane Irma, I believe one of the reasons why you saw so many large trees down after Hurricane Irma is because our ground was super saturated from this event here 2 weeks prior and had not dried out. So we saw we did see a catastrophic level of large mature tree loss and seawalls. Seawalls failed tremendously because of the amount of saturated soil that was behind them. And then in that particular case, we sort of had the opposite of sea level rise. We had an unusual hurricane event running up the middle of the state, blowing all the water out of our bays and estuaries, creating an extremely low tide, coupling that with a saturated soil condition. That's why you saw a whole lot of seawalls fail. But the point I was trying to make is that when you have sea level rise and the water elevations in our receiving waters are higher for longer periods of time, it takes longer for this water to run off and get out of our backyards. And of course, the other thing to think about too is, this water here, whatever is on the ground, this is my main road coming in. My driveway is down here, and you turn in over here. Even though it's a gravel road, and I love this location, everything that's on the ground here, from the droppings from the hydraulic oil, from the garbage truck that runs back here, to the vehicle products that we produce, brake dust, you name it. Not to mention fertilizers, although I don't fertilize, and I do pick up my dog's waste in the backyards. I'm probably exclusive in my neighborhood of doing that. All of this stuff mixes together, and eventually it runs off and finds its way into our main water bodies. So that's another downside to sea level rise, is a longer retention of that stormwater on those upland areas, mixing all those pollutants. And then when they finally do recede, it takes all that stuff out there with it. So that's it. Thank you. Any questions? Oh, good. Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Kelly? Yes. Come on up.